Have you ever watched a man in a $4,000 Brioni suit sweat through expensive silk in the middle of a board meeting? I have. That was the exact moment our new chief financial officer realized his scheme to doctor our metrics for a massive bonus had just vaporized the entire company valuation. Down here in Austin, executives believe cash is king. They always forget the person who writes the contracts actually holds the detonator. Hello and welcome back to the Boss Revenge Stories channel. I want to be completely transparent with you. YouTube has unfortunately disabled monetization for our channel, leaving us without a budget to operate. If you enjoyed today's story, please consider supporting us with just $1 so we can pay our team to cover their living expenses and continue bringing you these satisfying revenge tales. You can support us by scanning the QR code on your screen or clicking the donation link in the video description and comments. My name is Addison Stewart. I am 34 years old and the lead systems architect at Vanguard Horizon Systems, a business-to-business software infrastructure provider based in Austin, Texas. I am the person they call when servers are melting down at 3 in the morning. The ghost in the machine who untangles catastrophic code dependencies while the rest of the world is sleeping. You will rarely find me in the company celebration photos holding a glass of cheap champagne, and I almost never attend the mandatory corporate mixers. I prefer the quiet, steady hum of the server rooms and the absolute logic of a well-written code base over the forced socialization of corporate politics. I built the very foundation this company runs on, layer by layer, script by script. Life at Vanguard was predictably chaotic, but manageable until the arrival of Julian Vance. Julian was our brand new chief financial officer, freshly imported from a notoriously aggressive Wall Street firm. He brought with him a resume so polished it practically reflected his blinding white teeth, and he wore bespoke suits that cost more than a junior developer's monthly salary. Julian used corporate buzzwords like they were punctuation marks. Every conversation with him inevitably circled back to cash flow optimization, lean restructuring, and maximizing shareholder value. He treated our complex enterprise software like an old, rusty assembly line, completely oblivious to the fact that maintaining a zero-downtime architecture requires highly specialized engineers, not just a spreadsheet of disposable assets. To him, the engineering department was not the engine keeping the company alive. We were simply an inflated cost center that needed to be violently trimmed down. He would stroll past our desks, sipping his artisanal espresso, looking at my developers and seeing nothing but dollar signs bleeding out of his precious ledgers. The breaking point arrived during our first quarter all-hands town hall meeting. Nearly 300 employees were logged onto the massive Zoom call, expecting the usual boring updates about quarterly sales goals and human resources policies. Instead, Julian took over the screen share. He did not present the standard financial projections. He pulled up a highly stylized, customized performance dashboard focused entirely on the engineering department's uptime and reliability metrics. The screen was a blinding sea of bleeding red charts and steep, downward trending graphs. According to the visual data he proudly displayed, my team was failing spectacularly. I leaned closer to my monitor, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. I knew our system health intimately. We handled millions of requests per second for top-tier enterprise clients without a single dropped packet. We had maintained a flawless 99.9% uptime for the last 2 years. Yet, the giant bold numbers on Julian's slide deck showed a dismal 82% success rate. Before anyone could even raise a virtual hand to ask a question, Julian adjusted his designer glasses and cleared his throat. Leaning into the microphone, "As you can clearly see from these updated figures," Julian announced, his tone dripping with manufactured, fake sympathy. "We have some serious operational inefficiencies in our technical wing. I recently took the liberty of recalibrating our response time measurement metrics to align with stricter financial reporting. To get a true picture of our performance, I applied this new standard retroactively over the past 6 months. He had literally changed the rules of the game after it was already played. He had quietly instructed his analysts to change the definition of a successful server response. Instead of our industry standard 200 milliseconds, He arbitrarily lowered the threshold to an impossible 50 milliseconds, and then applied this metric to half a year of historical data. By tightening the latency thresholds and applying them to the past, he had artificially manufactured a crisis. A perfect 99.9% record was wiped out in an instant, replaced by an 82% failure rate that made my brilliant engineers look completely incompetent. But Julian was not done. He paused for dramatic effect, letting the red numbers burn into the retinas of the entire company. Because of this chronic underperformance, he continued, his voice hardening into a corporate command, we have no choice but to implement immediate corrective measures to protect the financial health of Vanguard Horizon Systems. Effective next week, we will be executing a 40% headcount reduction across the engineering department. Furthermore, all performance bonuses for the technical staff are frozen indefinitely until these metrics return to an acceptable baseline. A dead, suffocating silence descended over the virtual meeting. 300 little squares on the Zoom grid sat completely frozen in shock. My Slack notifications began exploding with a barrage of panicked messages from my team. It looked like a digital war zone. I saw messages from developers who had just closed on houses and engineers who were expecting newborn babies. They had worked 80-hour weeks during the holidays to launch our flagship product, and now they were facing sudden unemployment because a finance guy decided to manipulate a spreadsheet. I could feel my heart pounding against my ribs, a hot, venomous wave of pure anger rising in my chest. I wanted to unmute my microphone and scream at him. I wanted to call him a fraud in front of everyone and tear his fake metrics apart piece by piece. But I did not. In the corporate tech world, emotion is a vulnerability they use against you. I kept my face entirely neutral, staring directly into my webcam with cold, dead eyes. My hand moved steadily over my keyboard. I took a high-resolution screenshot of his fraudulent dashboard. Then, I opened a secure, encrypted blank document and meticulously typed out the exact word-for-word fallacies he had just spoken. Julian thought he was dealing with a bunch of naive, socially awkward computer nerds who would just pack their cardboard boxes and cry in the parking lot. He had absolutely no idea. He had just handed the lead systems architect the exact ammunition needed to burn his corporate empire to the ground. The Zoom window snapped shut, leaving my home office bathed in the harsh, blue light of my 3 monitors. The deafening silence of the apartment contrasted sharply with the chaotic flood of internal messages lighting up my secondary screen. My team was panicking, begging for answers I did not yet have. I ignored the notifications. In the world of corporate tech, panic is a useless emotion. Data is the only currency that matters. Julian had presented his altered reality to the board, but numbers do not spontaneously shift without human intervention. Someone had to query the database, rewrite the parameters, and generate that fraudulent report. I was going to find out exactly how deep the rot went. As the lead systems architect, my administrative privileges extended far beyond the engineering servers. I essentially held the master digital keys to the entire Vanguard Horizon network. I routed my connection through a secure virtual private network, actively masking my internal protocol address to ensure my digital footprints remained invisible. Then, I bypassed the standard employee directory restrictions and dove straight into the executive access logs. For 4 straight hours, I sat in the dark, sipping cold coffee and sifting through endless lines of alphanumeric code. I was not looking for what Julian had changed because I already knew the outcome. I was looking for the metadata trailing behind his actions. I wrote a quick parsing script to isolate Julian's administrative footprint over the last 30 days. The script hit a massive wall of encrypted traffic. I noticed a highly irregular pattern of large data packets moving between Julian's private company cloud drive and an external, unlisted domain. I ran a domain name system lookup and traced the address. It belonged to a premier mergers and acquisitions law firm based in New York City. The metadata tagged these encrypted packets under a highly restricted directory named Project Apex. Standard financial officers do not hide internal performance reports behind military-grade encryption unless those reports are being packaged for an outside buyer. I deployed a decryption key I had originally designed for emergency disaster recovery. It took the server farm nearly 45 minutes of brute force processing to crack the encryption. When the lock finally broke, the sheer magnitude of Julian's deception spilled across my primary monitor. Vanguard Horizon Systems was not just undergoing a lean restructuring phase. We were deep in secret negotiations to be acquired by a massive, multinational tech conglomerate. The preliminary term sheets were already drafted and signed by our chief executive officer, but there was a massive catch hidden in the fine print. The final acquisition price, and whether the deal went through at all, was directly tied to our operating profit margin for the current fiscal quarter. I dug deeper, opening Julian's personal executive compensation contract, which was neatly filed in the same hidden directory. There it was, highlighted in stark, undeniable legal jargon. If Julian successfully brokered the sale and hit the buyer's target valuation, his contract guaranteed him an immediate, massive executive payout upon the completion of the merger. A classic golden parachute. The amount was clearly spelled out. It was exactly $5 million. Suddenly, the fraudulent dashboard from the town hall meeting made perfect, sickening sense. Julian did not care about server response times, packet loss, or system efficiency. He needed to artificially inflate the company's profit margins by slashing expenses to make the company look irresistible to the buyers. The fastest, most ruthless way to boost cash flow on paper is to completely eliminate your largest expense category. In our company, that was the salaries and benefits of the entire engineering department. However, you cannot simply fire almost half of your most crucial technical staff right before a major acquisition without raising massive red flags during the buyer's due diligence process. If the buyers saw that the core infrastructure was stable, they would demand to know why the builders were suddenly being terminated. It would look like a desperate cash grab. Julian needed an airtight alibi. So, he fabricated a systemic failure by retroactively altering our performance metrics from a 200 millisecond threshold to an impossible 50 millisecond threshold. He created a documented, legally defensible excuse to terminate 40% of my team for cause. Firing employees for documented underperformance meant the company did not have to pay out expensive severance packages. It meant the board of directors would not question the sudden drop in headcount. They would simply praise their bold new financial officer for aggressively cleaning up an allegedly failing department. Julian was literally manufacturing a digital crisis to justify a real-world slaughter. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the $5 million figure glowing on my screen. The utter callousness of his plan was breathtaking. I thought about my lead database engineer, who had missed his daughter's 3rd birthday party last month because we were migrating servers to keep the company afloat during a traffic spike. I thought about the junior developers who had slept under their desks on cheap air mattresses during our initial launch phase, burning themselves out to build the very product Julian was now selling. He was entirely willing to destroy the livelihoods of dozens of hardworking families just so he could purchase a 3rd vacation mansion or add another Italian sports car to his collection. For a brief, naive moment, my hand hovered over my phone. Corporate protocol dictated that I immediately forward these decrypted files to the head of human resources and file a formal whistleblower complaint, but I let my hand drop to my side. Human resources is not designed to protect the employees. They exist solely to protect the corporation from legal liability. If I handed them this evidence, they would simply alert the board of directors, sweep my findings under the rug, and find a quieter, entirely legal way to push me out of the company for violating unauthorized data access policies. Playing by the conventional, polite corporate rules would only result in my own destruction. The burning, chaotic outrage in my chest slowly cooled, crystallizing into a calm, absolute focus. I closed the decrypted folder and meticulously wiped my terminal history, leaving zero trace of my investigation. Julian Vance believed he had outsmarted the entire system by manipulating the rules at the very top. He truly believed his financial manipulations governed the universe. I stared into the dark screen of my terminal. I was not going to file a complaint. I was not going to beg for our jobs. I was going to weaponize Vanguard Horizon's own rigid legal framework and let his own greed pull the trigger. The glow of the terminal felt fundamentally different now. It was no longer just a window into the company's digital architecture. It was a loaded armory. If Julian Vance wanted to play a high-stakes game of hidden technicalities and weaponized data to secure his millions, he was blindly stepping into a complex battlefield I had engineered from the ground up. I closed the active server logs and opened a secure, heavily encrypted tunnel to our off-site cold storage arrays. These massive server banks housed the foundational history of Vanguard Horizon systems. I navigated deep through layers of forgotten archival directories until I reached the digital vault labeled 2019. Back in that era, we were not a bloated corporate giant preparing for a massive Wall Street acquisition. We were a hungry, desperate startup operating out of a cramped co-working space, bleeding venture capital every single day and begging enterprise clients to trust us with their critical infrastructure. I paused my search, opening a highly restricted directory containing our original, foundational legal frameworks. I vividly remembered sitting in a dingy, windowless conference room at 2 a.m. alongside our former general counsel, a brilliant but exceptionally paranoid lawyer named Marcus. We were desperately trying to land our very first major corporate whale, a massive Fortune 50 conglomerate that was terrified of trusting a young startup with their sensitive data to win their business. Marcus and I drafted a foundational contract so flawlessly airtight, so aggressively skewed in the client's favor, that it forced them to sign on the dotted line. It was an ironclad, indisputable guarantee of our technical integrity. We called it the Master Services Agreement Reversion Clause. Among the original engineering team, we simply referred to it as the Blood Covenant. The core concept behind the Reversion Clause was born from pure engineering paranoia combined with ruthless, unbreakable legal binding. Massive enterprise clients live in constant fear of third-party vendors baiting them in and then secretly changing the terms of service or degrading performance after the integration is complete. So, I wrote a specific, highly sensitive trigger directly into our billing and compliance infrastructure. The clause explicitly stated that if Vanguard Horizon systems ever unilaterally downgraded, altered, or retroactively adjusted the service-level agreement performance metrics without explicit, prior written consent from the client, a catastrophic automated failsafe would immediately engage. I pulled up the original text of the contract on my left monitor, reading the dense legal jargon I had helped formulate years ago. It was a masterpiece of mutually assured destruction. If triggered, the clause executed 2 distinct automated actions simultaneously. First, it immediately locked down our entire automated payment gateway. Every single recurring revenue stream, every scheduled monthly invoice, every automated bank draft tied to our top-tier clients would be instantly frozen. The corporate cash flow would completely and violently stop. But the second automated action was the true kill shot, to legally prove that our core systems were not fundamentally flawed or actively compromised. The reversion clause legally compelled Vanguard Horizon to temporarily hand over a mirrored, read-only copy of our core source code to the affected clients for a comprehensive, independent third-party audit. In the enterprise technology industry, your proprietary intellectual property is your entire valuation. If an acquiring conglomerate discovers during due diligence that your secret source code is suddenly legally exposed to outside corporate entities due to a massive internal compliance breach, the value of that intellectual property drops to absolutely nothing. It renders the company utterly toxic and completely unsellable. Julian was a finance guy. He lived exclusively in a sterile world of pivot tables, quarterly projections, and slick boardroom presentations. He looked at complex engineering metrics and saw only flexible numbers he could manipulate to justify his massive golden parachute. He had absolutely no idea that those specific numbers were hard-coded into the immutable legal bedrock of our largest revenue-generating contracts. I needed to be absolutely, perfectly certain before I armed the system. I cross-referenced the compliance database with the automated client communications log. I filtered the search parameters for any official legal notices, addendums, or consent forms sent to our top 10 largest clients within the last 48 hours. The query rapidly searched the servers and returned 0 results. Julian had been so arrogant, so entirely focused on blinding the board of directors and the acquisition team with his fake, bleeding red dashboard, that he had entirely bypassed the legal department. He had pushed the new metric parameters directly to the reporting servers without securing a single signature of consent from the clients whose historical data he had just fundamentally redefined. He had unknowingly violated the exact terms of the reversion clause. The trap was perfectly set, but because his changes were disguised as an internal reporting update, it required a manual override to force the system to recognize the hidden dashboard changes as a formal compliance breach. The automated system needed undeniable proof. I cracked my knuckles, took a slow breath, and opened my primary coding environment. It was time to build the detonator. I started writing a highly specialized, deeply buried execution script. It felt exactly like assembling a complex mechanical watch in the pitch dark. Every single line of code had to be perfect, flawless, and completely untraceable to my personal workstation. I began by extracting Julian's unique digital administrative signature from the exact millisecond he altered the performance threshold from 200 milliseconds down to 50 milliseconds. I captured the system timestamps, the exact database query syntax he ran, and the specific user identification credentials he utilized to force the retroactive update. Next, I wrote a binding function that attached his unauthorized system logs directly to the compliance monitoring engine. The script would secretly take his digital footprints, perfectly format them into a verified internal audit report, and feed them straight into the automated contract management system. I was not hacking the company. I was not doing anything illegal. I was simply ensuring that the automated compliance systems functioned exactly as they were designed to when a catastrophic breach occurred. I built heavy layers of redundancy into the payload. Once the script executed, it would instantly lock its own directory, heavily encrypt its source logs, and automatically revoke all administrative privileges capable of aborting the sequence. It would act like an impenetrable digital firewall, preventing Julian, the internal tech support department, or anyone else from stopping the chain reaction once it started. The system operated purely on cold, hard binary logic. It did not care about corporate politics, delicate acquisition deals, or executive bonuses. It only knew whether a condition was true or false. I spent the next 3 hours testing the script in a localized, completely isolated sandbox environment. I ran brutal simulated attacks against the logic loop, trying to find any possible way to break my own code. The execution held firm and triggered perfectly every single time. It was a pristine, unstoppable piece of digital engineering. The payload was packaged, verified, and silently loaded into the active deployment queue, waiting quietly in the deep shadows of the server architecture. All I needed now was the perfect moment to pull the trigger. Patience is the most lethal weapon in a corporate war. I did not execute the payload on Tuesday or Wednesday. I let the agonizing week drag on, allowing the dread of the impending 40% layoff to settle over the engineering floor like a suffocating blanket. I waited while Julian strutted through the hallways, projecting the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had successfully rigged the casino. I needed him at the absolute height of his victory lap, completely exposed and entirely dependent on the fraudulent numbers he had built his golden parachute upon. The perfect moment finally arrived on Friday afternoon. The executive suite was vibrating with a sickening level of nervous excitement. Julian was hosting the final critical due diligence meeting with the senior partners from the acquiring tech conglomerate. They were barricaded inside the main glass-walled boardroom on the top floor, surrounded by catered lunch trays and bound copies of the merger agreements. This was the final hurdle. The acquiring partners just needed to verify the current quarter revenue streams and sign off on the projected profit margins before releasing the funds. I sat alone at my desk in the dimly lit corner of the engineering wing. My monitors were the only source of light. On my left screen, I had a live, read-only feed of the boardroom's presentation display. Julian was standing at the head of the massive oak table, pointing a laser pointer at a graph that showed our skyrocketing cash flow. He was selling them the lie. He was selling them the bloated, artificial profit margins he had manufactured by slitting the throats of my team. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of my terminal. It was exactly 2:14 in the afternoon. The time for waiting was over. I moved my finger over the heavy mechanical enter key on my keyboard. I did not hesitate. I pressed it down with a sharp, decisive click. The payload deployed instantly. It was silent, invisible, and completely devastating. My custom script tore out of its isolated sandbox and sprinted across the internal network. It smashed into the compliance monitoring engine, violently shoving Julian's verified administrative logs directly into the automated audit processor. The internal system did not pause to ask for human context. It did not send an email to the legal department asking for a discretionary review. Enterprise compliance architecture operates on absolute, merciless binary logic. It scanned the encrypted logs, cross-referenced the retroactive metric changes against the Master Services Agreement database, and registered a catastrophic, undeniable violation. Condition met. Logic loop closed. Execution initiated. Deep inside the server room, the automated contract management system woke up and immediately went to war. The first wave of digital destruction hit the outbound mail servers. High priority. Automated legal notices bypassed all standard marketing delays and fired off like guided missiles. They were not sent to middle management. They were blasted directly into the private, heavily guarded inboxes of the chief executive officers and chief legal counsels of our top 10 largest enterprise clients. The subject lines were identical, written in the cold, unforgiving language of automated corporate doom. Notice of payment suspension and source code review activation due to metric commitment violation. The emails contained the mathematically proven logs showing that Vanguard Horizon had unilaterally manipulated their historical service level agreement data. A fraction of a second later, the second wave hit our financial infrastructure. The billing application programming interfaces received the ultimate kill command. The system reached out to our payment processors and violently slammed the digital gates shut. Every single automated clearinghouse draft, every scheduled wire transfer, every recurring credit card charge tied to those top 10 enterprise accounts was instantly frozen and locked down under legal hold. Nearly $40 million in annual recurring revenue was paralyzed in less than 60 seconds. I shifted my eyes back to the live feed of the boardroom presentation. Julian was still talking, gesturing broadly toward the buyers, completely unaware of the digital apocalypse silently ripping through the walls around him. He tapped his keyboard to refresh his live financial dashboard, eager to show the acquiring partners the real-time processing of the afternoon invoices. The web browser refreshed. The massive, beautiful green bars representing our monthly recurring revenue flickered wildly for a split second. Then, the automated system pulled the locked accounts out of the active ledger. The green bars instantly vanished. The live revenue counter at the top of the screen dropped like a stone, tumbling from tens of millions down to a flat, horrific zero. Inside the boardroom, the confident smiles of the acquiring partners instantly vanished, replaced by looks of total bewilderment. Julian froze mid-sentence, his mouth hanging slightly open as he stared at the giant screen. He tapped the refresh button again, his finger frantically jabbing the plastic key. The screen blinked, but the massive zero remained permanently burned into the dashboard. Back at my desk, the chaos of the outside world felt miles away. I leaned back in my chair and picked up my ceramic mug. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my black coffee. The bitter, dark roast tasted incredible. I turned my attention to my primary terminal, watching the smooth, perfectly ordered blue lines of confirmation text cascading endlessly down the black screen. The script was returning a flawless execution report. The trap had successfully snapped shut, and I had a front-row seat to the total collapse of Julian Vance's delusional financial empire. The silence in my corner of the office was suddenly shattered by the simultaneous, shrill ringing of every single desk phone on the executive floor. It sounded like a frantic symphony of pure panic. On my secondary monitor, the private executive Slack channel, which I had quietly granted myself red access to months ago, erupted into a chaotic waterfall of red alert notifications. It was a digital stampede. Vice presidents were typing in all capital letters, demanding to know why the legal servers were mass emailing clients. The chief operating officer was repeatedly posting question marks. Inside the main boardroom, the atmosphere had violently mutated from a triumphant celebration into a hostile interrogation in less than 30 seconds. The lead partner from the acquiring conglomerate did not wait for Julian to fix his frozen presentation. His smartphone had already intercepted a forwarded copy of the automated legal notice from his own technical due diligence team. The partner stood up, aggressively slamming his hands flat against the polished oak table. He demanded an immediate explanation for the phrase intellectual property source code review and wanted to know exactly why nearly $40 million in verified revenue had just evaporated into thin air. Julian looked exactly like a deer caught in the headlights of a speeding freight train. The custom-tailored Brioni suit he wore so proudly was rapidly absorbing a heavy, dark layer of terrified sweat. Julian abandoned the boardroom, sprinting out the glass doors and into the hallway with his mobile phone pressed aggressively to his ear. I watched through the office partitions as he paced furiously, waving his free arm in the air. My terminal intercepted his frantic, elevated network calls to the Internal Information Technology Service Desk. He was screaming at the junior network administrators, ordering them to physically unplug the database servers, to shut down the firewall, to do absolutely anything to recall the automated legal emails and unlock the billing gateways. The head of the Information Technology Department practically stuttered as he delivered the fatal news over the internal comms. He explained that his entire team had zero control. The compliance system had automatically engaged a localized evidentiary lockdown. All global administrative privileges, including Julian's, the chief executive officers, and the IT directors, had been instantly suspended to protect the digital forensic integrity of the breach. The machine was in complete control now, operating on pure, cold logic, and it was absolutely not taking orders from panicking executives. Before Julian could even process that technical failure, a new, high-priority email notification chimed across every active screen in the building. It was from Elena, our current general counsel. Elena was a notoriously ruthless corporate lawyer who rarely sent company-wide communications unless a massive lawsuit was imminent. Her message was brief, legally sterile, and utterly devastating. She confirmed to the entire executive branch that a Tier 1 legal crisis had just been initiated. She stated clearly that the Master Services Agreement reversion clause was officially active, valid, and legally binding. The automated system had correctly identified a massive, unsanctioned compliance breach, and Vanguard Horizon Systems was now legally obligated to expose our highly confidential proprietary source code to our top clients within 48 hours. If we failed to comply, we would face immediate, catastrophic breach of contract lawsuits that would bankrupt the firm. Cornered animals always lash out at whatever is closest to them. Julian needed a scapegoat to take the fall for the collapsing merger, and he needed one immediately. My desktop calendar application chimed violently. Julian had initiated an emergency Zoom meeting and forcibly pulled me into the digital room. Along with Elena and our completely bewildered chief executive officer, I calmly accepted the video invitation and turned on my high-definition webcam. Julian was pacing wildly inside a small, glass-enclosed soundproof phone booth down the hall. His perfectly styled hair was a messy, frantic disaster, and his face was flushed bright red with rage. "You sabotaged us!" Julian screamed into his microphone, completely abandoning any remaining facade of corporate professionalism. His voice was cracking with raw, unhinged hysteria. "You hacked the compliance engine. You intentionally hijacked the billing gateways to destroy this acquisition deal. I know you did this because you were angry about the headcount reduction. I am going to have you arrested for corporate espionage. Addison, I will personally see to it that you never work in the technology sector ever again." I did not raise my voice. I did not blink, and I certainly did not display an ounce of fear. I let his desperate, hollow threats hang in the digital air for a few agonizing seconds. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair and took another slow sip of my coffee, looking directly into the camera lens. I did not change the contract. Julian, I said, my voice completely flat and devoid of any emotion. And I certainly did not hack the system. I simply allowed our automated compliance architecture to do exactly what it was designed to do. I clicked the green button at the bottom of my screen and shared my primary terminal window with the entire virtual room. I brought up the pristine, mathematically undeniable system audit log. I highlighted the exact strings of data using my cursor, guiding their eyes to the unalterable truth. The system detected a severe unauthorized manipulation of client data, I explained calmly, maintaining the tone of someone conducting a highly routine training seminar. Someone intentionally bypassed the legal department and manually downgraded our historical service level agreement metrics from a 200 millisecond baseline down to an impossible 50 millisecond baseline. They then applied this new metric retroactively over the past 6 months to artificially manufacture a documented failure rate. I scrolled down to the final, fatal lines of the cryptographic audit report. The compliance engine instantly isolated this security breach and logged the specific user who executed the database change. As you can see right here on the screen, the system cryptographically verified the unique digital signature, the exact timestamp, and the executive administrative credentials used to alter the reporting servers. I paused, letting my cursor rest firmly on his name, which was printed in bright, unavoidable white text against the black terminal background. I did not sabotage the company. Julian, I just protected the company from your data fraud according to standard procedure. The silence that followed was absolute and incredibly heavy. Julian stopped pacing. He stood perfectly still in the center of the tiny phone booth. The aggressive, arrogant red color drained entirely from his face in a matter of seconds, replaced by a sickening, chalky white pallor. His mouth opened and closed silently, but his vocal cords completely failed him. He stared at his own digital signature on the screen, the undeniable, ironclad proof of his own financial manipulation. Elena, the general counsel, let out a sharp, highly audible gasp through her microphone as the severe legal reality of the situation fully materialized in her mind. I leaned forward, looking straight at Julian's horrified face, and delivered the final, crushing blow. And just to ensure strict regulatory compliance, I added softly, the system has already automatically forwarded this entire, unalterable audit log directly to the private inboxes of our entire board of directors. Julian slowly sank backward into the small chair behind him, staring blankly into the void of his webcam. A man completely and totally destroyed by his own arrogant creation. The weekend passed in a state of suspended animation. By the time Monday morning arrived, the atmosphere inside the corporate headquarters was heavy enough to crush coal into diamonds. The board of directors had summoned an emergency, mandatory session at 8 o'clock sharp. I was instructed to attend, sitting quietly at the far end of the massive mahogany table. Julian Vance stood at the front of the room, sweating profusely despite the aggressive air conditioning. He was desperately trying to control the narrative, weaving a frantic tale about a rogue software glitch and aggressive system misconfigurations. He pleaded with the board, insisting that the compliance lockdown was merely a temporary technical anomaly and that the merger could still be salvaged if they just let him renegotiate the terms. He was so focused on saving his own skin that he failed to grasp the reality of the room. Sitting directly opposite the board members were the senior partners from the acquiring tech conglomerate. They had not come to renegotiate Julian's broken deal. They had come to deliver a verdict. The lead partner, a silver-haired veteran of corporate warfare, raised his hand, instantly silencing Julian's frantic rambling. The partner stated with absolute finality that the original acquisition agreement was entirely null and void. The legal exposure and the fraudulent data manipulation orchestrated by the chief financial officer presented an unacceptable level of risk. The room went completely still as Julian's shoulders violently slumped. His $5 million golden parachute was evaporating right before his eyes. But then, the lead partner did something entirely unexpected. He turned his chair slightly, directing his sharp gaze entirely away from the executive board and focusing directly on me. We spend millions of dollars every single year trying to build system architectures that cannot be compromised by human greed, the partner said, his voice echoing in the quiet boardroom. When the alerts triggered on Friday, our initial reaction was panic, but after our technical teams reviewed the audit logs over the weekend, they realized exactly what had happened. They did not find a flawed system. They found an impenetrable fortress. Your infrastructure protected the integrity of the data at the absolute expense of the executive who tried to manipulate it. That level of uncompromising, automated accountability is exactly what our conglomerate needs. The partner leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and delivered a brutal, unyielding ultimatum to our board of directors. The conglomerate was still willing to inject massive capital and rescue Vanguard Horizon systems under a newly restructured valuation. However, this financial lifeline came with two non-negotiable conditions. First, the partner declared, pointing a remarkably steady finger at Julian, Mr. Vance is to be terminated immediately, effectively today, under the explicit grounds of gross negligence and corporate fraud. He will receive no severance, and his executive bonus is completely and permanently voided. Julian gasped, his face turning an ashen shade of gray. He opened his mouth to protest, but the chief executive officer shot him a look of such pure venom that he instantly snapped his jaw shut. Second, the partner continued, his eyes locking back onto mine. We require a leadership team that actually understands the value of the machinery they operate. Addison Stewart will be immediately promoted to the position of Chief Technology Officer. She will personally lead the technical integration of our two companies. Furthermore, the proposed 40% reduction in the engineering department is entirely canceled, and her departmental budget is to be immediately doubled to ensure the continued stability of the network. It took every ounce of professional restraint I possessed to keep a neutral expression on my face. The board of directors, desperate to save their own equity and prevent a total corporate bankruptcy, unanimously voted to accept the terms on the spot. 2 hours later, the engineering floor was completely silent, but this time it was a silence of absolute awe. Every single developer, network administrator, and database engineer stood up from their desks. They watched in quiet, total satisfaction as Julian Vance, stripped of his title and his immense ego, walked out of the executive suite carrying a small, cheap cardboard box filled with his personal belongings. He kept his head entirely bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the very people he had tried to destroy just 3 days earlier. 2 armed security guards escorted him to the elevator, ensuring he would never step foot inside the building again. I walked back to my desk and sat down in the familiar comfort of my ergonomic chair. I opened the master server directory and securely archived the Friday compliance audit logs, officially closing the digital book on Julian's disastrous reign. I took a slow sip of my coffee, finally allowing a small, genuine smile to break across my face. Down here in Austin, executives will always believe that cash is king, but as I watched the green lights of our server racks blinking perfectly in unison, I realized the ultimate truth of the corporate world. The person who only knows how to count the money will always be at the absolute mercy of the person who writes the rules. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. I would love to know where you are listening from, so please let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video and want to help us keep this channel alive, please consider supporting us with just $1. You can donate by scanning the QR code on your screen right now, or by clicking the donation link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your support goes directly toward paying our hardworking team, helping them support their families, and allowing us to continue creating more satisfying revenge stories for you. Thank you again, and have a wonderful day.